On this episode of the podcast, I have me Anand Madhavan. He is the VP of Engineering at Everlaw. We're going to be talking about unique development models. And obviously, when you join a company, you do have to make some adjustments. They're going to do things a little bit differently. Development model might be a little atypical. You're going to have to learn, adopt, absorb. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about that. And we're going to be talking about what Everlaw is doing, killing deadlines, higher quality code base, and long-term thinking. We're going to see how that's impacting the culture and some other things if we can fit it in. Anand, thanks for taking the time.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Amir.
Absolutely. All right. Before we dive in, what does Everlaw do?
So Everlaw is a SaaS software for litigation professionals to use for the process of litigation. So we have a lot of tools that we build that allow for the litigation flow to be smooth. We call ourselves a truth-finding machine. A lot of things that we do sweat the details because we are in the core workflows that people use day in and day out. So that's kind of part of our special sauce.
There you go. Well, I guess, we're going to be talking about this episode, about development models. And we got to this topic because you mentioned, obviously, you guys do something slightly different, and we're going to talk about that. I guess as a leader, and you've been there for a number of years, but whenever a leader joins someplace new, obviously, I always wonder how much of an adjustment they need to make. They need to come in, assess, they need to understand. When you're joining a company, and you're trying to, as a leader, understand the development model, the development culture, how do you approach that in your first 30, 60, 90 days?
There is a great book called The First 90 Days, which I read. I do think this is quite a useful approach across any gig that you join. And part of that is just to understand the situation that you're going into. And in my case, it was very much a case of I found the place that resonated culturally quite strongly in terms of how Everlaw had already thought about things, and so for me, when I even going through the interview process, a lot of things just resonated in terms of how things were being done, both in terms of having worked at some of the bigger hypergrowth companies as well as startups. I had seen a lot of things that had worked very well and a lot of things that did not work well, and it felt like a lot of those core elements were in play at Everlaw. So it didn't feel like a big change for me to make coming into the culture. And in fact, I was, had gone through experiences where it didn't work necessarily in the industry, in the way that industry was doing certain things. And so coming into it, it felt almost very natural for me to take it from there and kind of build on top of that.
I guess when you look at that and when you're joining a company, you obviously bring in a lot of tools, right? You've already built out your toolbox. That's why they're hiring you. And obviously you walk into a situation where things are different and you're looking at your toolbox and wondering, okay, well, what am I going to apply of what I've done? And how do I actually assimilate also to their culture and their way of doing? Talk to us a little bit about when you joined Everlaw, some of that process of assimilating, but yet trying to still extract value from your existing toolbox.
Yeah, I think the general mental makeup for me has always been that try and understand as much as you can, and thus first, especially with the books, with this 90-day book, which is a great book of a lot of the pitfalls that leaders make when going into a company, especially around thinking that what they have seen and applied in previous gigs should apply in this situation. And I think oftentimes those are some of the mistakes. So one of the great advice from that book is to resist the action imperative, just until you have built that muscle to first establish the trust with the team, understand what's going on within the team, understand what needs to be changed, and if you need to make certain changes that are longer range, then having some perspective on what it might take to change that and what time frame that might entail. And so just assessing the ground is kind of first 90 days is a lot of that. And then of course you're trying to take some quick wins, but at the same time you're trying to assess bottoms up, problem solve, what are the core pain points, how can I rank them, and then what are some of the management patterns or design patterns that I might potentially borrow, but if needed invent ground up, so that you're always thinking bottoms up problem-solving approach to solving things. So that's kind of how I think about it, and that's the framework that I came in trying to first understand, identify the core pain points. Not all problems are core pain points sometimes, so you have to almost stack rank the problems, and then you identify the important ones to go solve. And when you're trying to solve them, you're trying to approach it from a first principle standpoint, which is, what is the problem statement? What is the current situation? What are the core elements that make it hard? And then how can I chip away at providing a solution that will work consistent with the time frame of the solve as well as the culture that we are in.
And I guess, we want to talk a little bit about how you do things slightly differently at Everlaw, because I think you mentioned some interesting things. So let's talk about some of those high level concepts, if you could. Maybe if you could pick a couple of the 2 or 3 most important ways you guys do engineering within that model that's maybe a little bit different than what people understand.
Yeah, our CEO AJ Shankar is a big proponent of this. He used to have a PhD in computer science, and much of his experiential learnings and core belief was that, and this resonated quite strongly with me, was that industry had it all wrong in some ways, because there was a lot of the dominant culture was to go after a certain deadline top down, almost predefined deadline, and then get your teams to run in a certain sprint format, whether a few week-long sprints, and try and deliver something in each sprint as a way to be agile. And I think the experience, however, in terms of outcomes is a little bit, if you just take stock of it, is that you end up cutting corners of some sort. You end up, first of all, code is complex. So as you go into the code base, you discover that, hey, there's actually many things here that we didn't think about when we set that early deadline. We discovered things about the complexity of the code base in terms of its design and reuse, or we discovered that certain parts of the code base are not conducive for what we thought it might do, or you discover that, hey, things that we built, that we had, but didn't think of certain performance considerations for the new use cases might come in the way, and we might actually need to design things a little differently for these use cases. Or it might be that as you go through it, you find some security holes that you need to plug. It could be that you have the system that existed didn't necessarily scale or was reliable, so you needed to rethink based on the use cases. So you just discover a lot of things as you go in an existing code base. And most code, as any startup, within a year or two will have a significant amount of code base that's built up. And so most companies are dealing with code bases that exist. And so then you're looking at a code base and saying, okay, actually, I gave a deadline, or I was given a deadline date, or I might have even come up with it. However, as I discover things, or even as I work with my design counterpart and product counterpart, we're discovering that there are certain things that are better done in certain ways, or certain design debt that is worth paying down, or certain product scope creep or cuts that are worthwhile doing. So it's a creative process with design elements, product elements, engineering elements that go into it, with a lot of engineering concerns that are part of it, from testability to maintainability to reliability, performance, etc. And so as you go along, what you do want, though, is coming out the other end, is to make sure that you are fixing bugs early, you are building maintainable code, because the cost is quite high for software to be maintained over time. And so just understanding that, and understanding that it takes much more effort as you go through the stages of release that to fix things. And so doing things in the right way, is important for us. Just because it leads to longer range health of the code base and even the people, because you're not burning out people, because they are happy building the things that they take pride in building. And so it leads to happy people, happy outcomes in the long range. What we sacrifice is intermediate latency of delivery of something. So for example, if you say, I want to ship something in line for a customer commit within 3 weeks or 2 months or whatever the time frame might be, this is not a great model for that, because we try and eschew those types of things, because especially in a B2B company where you have a lot of customers and you're trying to sell a lot of the product, if you keep committing to something, it all adds up to a lot of things that you might commit to. And this was the case in one of my previous companies that I worked at, where there's lots of small commits that would all add up, and then just things would just break in terms of the maintainability of the code as well as the developer happiness. And so we would have a lot of attrition of people just because they didn't like the model. And so it just made me feel like it was just the wrong way to build things. And so when I came here, it was just a breath of fresh air to kind of feel that we didn't necessarily, like if the typical sprint works like this. You go into the sprint, you got the burn down, you say, okay, we didn't meet the burn down, we're going to push it to the next one, and then we'll do better next. And that's kind of how it works. But there's this constant beating up yourself to then kind of get to a certain throughput rate in terms of story points or whatever else that you might be counting. And so it results in a bit of an elusive mirage, so if you will. But at the same time, if you just take an opposite viewpoint, which is that, hey, let's just trust the developers. We've hired good people. We've hired good engineers and designers and product and we trust them and we will support them in the right trade-off decisions to be made, and then trust them to make the right calls in terms of the design of the code base. And then, what does it take to then support them? And that's kind of how we frame the problem for management for us is like, and so that builds a lot of mutual respect with the creators and the builders on the ground. It empowers them. It gives them the autonomy to make certain decisions. We support them, and it leads to an overall longer range culture that is sustainable. And every company at some stage, unless you're a founder that's looking for a quick exit, is looking for some level of sustained value that you're adding.
When you think about, I guess as you mentioned before about pushing more, empowering more of the developers, designers, PM teams, when you look at that within your guys' development model, talk to us about the dynamics to the other teams, right? So obviously sales is one component, marketing is another component. When you're looking at trying to empower the developers and designers more, how does that get balanced with those other teams?
I mean, the core of it, first of all, is understanding the customer and making sure that we are prioritizing the customer and what they need in terms of their core needs and urgency of delivery of certain things. So we have this healthy urgency. So we're still in a race as a startup. At the same time, the race is a marathon, not a sprint, and so that's kind of the framing. If the other way to think about this is that, we call it the no deadline culture, but it comes with shipping functionality to users with healthy urgency. So the metaphor to keep in mind is that it's developing software is more like a long hike, not sprints, one step at a time. Enjoy the view, leave no garbage, but also try and get there before dark, and that's kind of the metaphor you want to keep in mind. And so it makes for an all-around pleasurable experience while still keeping competency and urgency top of mind. And in that world, where I have seen startups fail is oftentimes sales is asked to sell things with certain commits of functionality that does not exist today in the platform, but might be coming. And so they sell ahead of themselves. And so one of the things that we do very in a very disciplined fashion is to make sure that we don't sell things that we don't have, while at the same time providing as much transparency as we can as to where things stand and what is to be done, so that we have line of sight into what's when things may happen. And so that is called out at the very core in our what we call the Everlaw manifestos. Our CEO shares that pretty much with every single candidate prior to them accepting the offer, so that they know what they're walking into. And so there's a bit of us, and sometimes even before, along the interview stage, so that they can at least understand the culture. And if they want to self-select out, then they can self-select out. And oftentimes it results in people feeling pretty strongly about the culture. And then those are the people that end up joining us and buying into that. And so this includes the sales leaders, the marketing leads, etc. And so when they read that, for them, of course, no deadlines is shouting all kinds of bells in their mind with respect to when will this get shipped, how is this company moving, is it a slow dinosaur, things like that. But at the same time, when they read the rationale and then look at the amount of product that we ship every month in our release notes and so forth, it is just a sheer blistering pace of innovation and product that we ship compared to many of our competitors. And so it is both no deadlines and shipping functionality to users with healthy urgency that makes it work. And so there's both elements of these that go into our processes and cultural aspects and tooling and competency descriptions and document. A lot of things that downstream manifest in processes because of that.
I guess as that relationship, and you'd mentioned obviously one of the important things were to understand the culture within the team. So you mentioned empowering, thinking long term. When you look at where tech debt comes from, so it sounds like you guys are working very hard to delivering that high quality, keeping the high quality code base in play. Is there opportunities for tech debt to creep into this process? Where do you guys, or how do you guys view tech debt? I guess it'd be nice to kind of understand your perspective of tech debt.
Yeah, great question. Despite our best efforts, we still see tech debt coming, which makes us feel like we need to double down on our core principles even more so. And some of the things that we see are, as an example, subtle pressures coming from whoever asking for a timeline for delivery of certain things, to which then there is subtle pressure to ask the developer. I mean, the common things, you can go on Reddit and look at many of these comments from other developers, and I'll give you a flavor for that. Is I get asked something like, how many bugs do you expect to find, and how long do you expect they'll all take to fix and verify on a nearly daily basis? Somebody that was extremely frustrated with how we approach traditional industry-wide practices here. PM saying, we agreed to have only 15% of tech debt in each sprint. You'll have to move this to the next one. Exactly how things start to accumulate. Seriously, I wish I had $1 for every time in some stand-up I've said, if I knew what the problem is, it would already be fixed. But since I don't know what the problem is yet, I don't know how long it will take to fix. A classic symptom of things that you'll find as you go. And then another comment here that was this only works if you have a company that supports this way of working, which in my opinion is rare. I worked at one place where they wanted work output at a set cadence, and so every misestimated ticket turned into a struggle session during retro where we reflected on our own failure to burn down correctly and vowed to do a better job next sprint. Sales and management would also routinely make sales based on features we didn't have, so we missed release, and there were angry customers to navigate. So I think this is not Everlaw. This is outside of comments that are in Reddit channels that if you scour, you will see. And this happens on a day-to-day basis across so many companies, and companies that I've been at, companies that other people are still at. And so we try to say, okay, then what okay, if those are the natural pressures of any business, which is that sales or whoever is the stakeholder is looking for a certain commit in a certain time, and there are subtle pressures that manifest across the board, and of course, developers want to leave the place pristine. If you have that mindset and want to leave it pristine, there is a balance to be had, which is at what stage is it too much of give back of cleaning up the code base, and what stage is it? So it's not a black and white. It's a gray scale of decisions that you have to make. And so what we do is have a set of things that we leave in terms of principles, like no deadlines, like I mentioned. We try and learn continuously with retrospectives and so forth in any feature that we build. Core tenet is to not leave garbage behind. At the same time, there might be large efforts that you might have to undertake to clean up certain things or migrate to certain. As an example, we are migrating from Dojo to React. It's a fairly big effort. You can't just say to a developer, as you build the feature, migrate us to React. That's not going to happen. So that's a fairly large effort. And so you have to understand the complexity of the problem and resource things accordingly based on the type of effort that it is. But for the most part, here's what we do. We provide the air cover to have no deadlines. We support the engineers with people, with our own reviews. Managers are involved in the trade-off decisions. We have a notion of a technical. We try to keep code as flexible as possible for people to come in and develop against it, which means that there's a lot of documentation. There are owners of the code base that will steward the code base to make sure that it is consistent with the architecture that is intended. There is a lot of documentation that we invest in. There is built into many of the competencies for the roles that we have, like I mentioned, the technical mentor or the code reviewer or the developer that's building the code base. We have built in, this is mentioned about 18 times in our competency documents for the level about paying down technical debt and having the acumen to identify it, advocate for it, resolve it, things like that. And we make sure that highlight to developers that it is not all about shipping the number of features, it's about how you build things. And so a lot of the qualitative elements goes into the assessment of any developer during the focal review or annual reviews and so forth. And we make sure to educate managers to identify that certain things need to be done in certain ways, in which case, especially if it's coming from the engineers and there's a quorum of engineers that advocate for it, make sure to provide air cover for it, because you are going to be judged as well as a manager in terms of how you have provided the team with that air cover to go build things in the right way. So it incentivizes people accordingly. We break things down into, when you look at the competencies, we have about 5 competencies. We break things down evenly weighted. Much of it is about community. There's one part of the 5 that is specifically talking about how you build the code and develop in the domain expertise section, but much of the rest of it is about what are you deciding to prioritize, how are you problem solving, how to build it, community building, mentoring other people. And so a lot of these other things that are weighted very high end up building a very communal development space where people feel a sense of collaborative ownership. And so that is central to the model as well. And like you said, it requires a company and team-wide alignment. So we make sure to articulate that in front of the entire company. AJ is our CEO, so he's partly, I think, because he built the company. He was an engineer that built much of the code base. He's PhD in CS, and so he believes strongly in this. So he ends up providing that cover from the top down, which is extremely necessary, especially when sales is feeling a lot of competitive pressure to deliver X, Y, or Z in a certain time frame and sell against those. And then there is a very core tenet of balancing all of this with healthy urgency to ship functionality to users. Just having a very core user base that is extremely active in suggesting features and using the product in its in a day-to-day fashion just makes us feel like, okay, we really need to be delivering these things. Maybe this is good enough because it adds a lot of value to the existing use cases, that we don't need to boil the ocean on all the bells and whistles that might make this effective. So I think there's a line that we draw with which the closing brackets of this no deadline is the healthy urgency to ship things in a very passionate, and the product is loved by the people that use it, and so they advocate a lot for it, and which makes us even more motivated to ship things sooner than perfecting things and taking forever to ship it. So that's kind of the bookend that keeps it motivated. But of course, there's a lot of accountability, like I mentioned, incentives to do it. But we have to watch out for a lot of subtle pressures that set in about people being asked for dates. Developer might say that, hey, this is too big a task for me to go tackle. So there's a fear aspect to tackling a lot of tech debt that might be there in a certain domain, which is just suddenly open up as part of your feature development. So try to eliminate that fear with a lot of support structures that make sure that they are supported in tackling that change, even if it might be beyond what they felt confident doing. And with those, we have a technical mentor program which spans all aspects of the code base, and those technical mentors will usually guide you through what types of changes would be the right types of changes to make to accommodate a particular change request for a certain part of the code base that your feature unintendedly may span, which you didn't expect necessarily. So
I like that. I mean, it sounds like the environment is very engineering oriented, I guess, friendly. You've mentioned some things that typically other companies are striving to. I guess if you were just to look at your own engineering career and you look at where you're at now, to keep the culture the way it is, what are things that you have to keep focus on? Obviously, you mentioned the CEO background. This is important to them. So you could see there's an imprint top down. But from the standpoint of as you hire and scale and you bring others into it, to ensure that people are assimilating to this culture, what have you seen that helps people to, I guess, be a part of this culture and embrace it versus trying to still think that they have to rely on some of the things they used to do?
I mean, at the core of it is hiring engineers that like to code. I think if you don't like to code and you're trying to do something really fast and get things out, I think it tends to result in poor quality attention to details that we want, because at the end of the day, when you leave the company, you're leaving the code base behind, and so that's the asset that endures over time. And so if we don't have stewards of that, then it becomes a problem for us. So we look for those types of tendencies, just taking ownership, even in a place where you may not necessarily feel like it was called out at the beginning? Do you have that mindset so that you can go in tackling certain problems despite it not being something that you had planned for? Because that's part of what you might encounter here. And then the manager muscle is going to be extremely important, especially around being an engineer yourself as a manager and a good engineer in the past. And so it's not just people management, but genuinely having gone through first-person experiences of what we value and making sure that because you have gone through that, you yourself will feel motivated enough to protect that. And so that's an important part of the hiring process as well. And then along the way, there are just many things that we just may have to keep an eye out for and keep nurturing. And so debriefs kind of our way. Having said that, we do have exceptions when push comes to shove. There are certain projects that do have deadlines which we work towards, and so there are other. But at the same time, those are not the norm; they are the exceptions, and we try to minimize those exceptions. So.
Everything you said seems like people are going to definitely appreciate. And I know we haven't covered everything. I think it would be very hard to cover all the various aspects of what you guys do and how you do it. People might want to reach out to you to kind of pick your brain. What is a good way of connecting with you if somebody wants to follow up with you on something you mentioned on the show?
You can reach out to me on LinkedIn or X, or send me an email. I don't know if it is personal or professional, but I'm happy to share them with you as well, Amir.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, we'll definitely put some of those links in for people, your LinkedIn, your X, so that people can connect with you. And Anand, thanks for joining. Thanks for sharing. I really do appreciate it.
I absolutely enjoyed watching your podcasts, Amir. Thank you for doing this and for contributing to the community. I'm delighted to be part of the podcast, so thank you.
Absolutely. Again, thank you very much. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. Until then, two things. One, we talked about with Anand about joining a company with a different way, a different engineering culture. And I think, he went through and talked to us about what that culture looks like, the adjustments he's had to make, the relationship with other teams. It seems like it's a very good episode to listen to if you're an engineering leader and you're wondering how can you bring in some of those new wrinkles that Anand mentioned, or if you're just an engineer and you're curious about what you can do, there's some things that Anand mentioned that are definitely actionable by pretty much anybody. And I really would appreciate it if you would share this episode. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Please leave me a review of how the podcast is going. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.